July 4th, 1776 is considered America's birthday. But given what we know about America's roots enslaving Black people and building systems of oppression after slavery was abolished, I think it's time for a rebirth. My name is Nona Jones, and I am the founder of the Faith and Prejudice movement. Nathan Rutstein once said that prejudice is an emotional commitment to ignorance. The Faith and Prejudice movement exists to demonstrate our faith in God through the work of confronting and dismantling racism in America. This broadcast special features civil rights leaders, theologians, scholars, and advocates who have dedicated their lives and work to racial equity. I invite you to listen and learn so that we can mobilize our collective energy toward lasting change in this country.
Hi guys, my name is Yasmin Ruhi. This is my husband Ali Ruhi, and together we planted Center Set Church in the heart of Silicon Valley, California. We are so excited and honored to be one of the partnering churches in the Faith and Prejudice movement. We really do believe that racism is an evil spirit, and together with the churches combined as one, we can push back the darkness with the light and the hope and the love of Jesus. And we are just so excited to be partnering with everyone else as we lift up the name of Jesus to see the spirit eradicated in our country.
So well said. Yeah, we just believe that the change, this conversation has to happen in the local church. And before we ask the culture to change, before we ask America to change, we want our hearts to change. We're just believing by faith that if the church can get this right, if we can repent and grow in our empathy and grow in our learning of the pain of our brothers and sisters, and if change can begin first in our hearts and in the church, America can change. Amen?
Amen. We are so excited, and we cannot wait to see what the Lord does through the Faith and Prejudice movement. We hope that you can join us and join us in prayer.
On April 4th, 1968, at only 39 years old, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He had become an international voice of hope to many. But while he lived, he was also seen as an agitator and troublemaker. It wasn't until 1977, 9 years after his death, that he was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Although his famous "I Have a Dream" speech is quoted globally today, the fact that our nation sits in astonishment at the brutalizations of Black people 52 years after his death means the dream remains to be realized. Tonight, we're rounding out our week with two crucial conversations. One is a look back at the life and legacy of Dr. King with his youngest daughter and the CEO of the King Center for Nonviolent Social Change, Dr. Bernice King. And the second is with a panel of youth activists who are taking up the mantle of social justice leadership to make the dream of America real. First, Dr. King joins us to help us listen and learn about the dream of America. Dr. King, it is such a pleasure to speak with you as we round out this week of conversations and exploration into the history of race in America. Your father's name and legacy is synonymous with civil rights and social justice, but I really would love if we could start with his reality. You shared a story one time when I was at the King Center where you shared that when he received the Nobel Peace Prize and came back to Atlanta, he wasn't received in the way that many people would expect. It would be wonderful if you could share what that experience was like.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, in 1964, when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, the South was still, burdened with racism, and we were just coming through the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So all of the laws surrounding discrimination were fresh. And Atlanta was a little cold toward embracing him during that time. And there were a few business leaders behind the scene who decided it was not good for business if they did not recognize their city's Nobel Peace Prize recipient. It would almost be a direct insult, and it would cast them in a bad light. And so Woodruff of the Coca-Cola company started reaching out to other business leaders to convince them that this was the right thing to do. So as we see during that time, and we can talk about this later, a white business leader who used their influence to make sure that the right thing was done. And so it was the first time in the history of the city where an integrated audience gathered. I think it was the Dinkler Hotel here in Atlanta, Georgia, to celebrate him and commemorate him. And they gave him some kind of Steuben glass bowl in recognition of his honor. So he, it's kind of like the prophet being without honor, but in this case, the prophet being without honor, also because of the color of his skin, frankly.
I think that's so important for people to realize, because I think the memory of who your father was, people think of him as, oh, of course we would honor him. Of course we would celebrate
today.
Him. Right, today. But back then, it took literally a move, as you said, of people who felt like, no, this is the right thing to do.
And there was, I want to say this, there was a poll, and I think it was 1967-ish, that ranked him as one of the most hated men in America.
Yep. And we have to know that, because I think some people sitting in this moment, they're thinking, oh my gosh, what would Dr. King do? And it's like, well, he wasn't the beloved person
No,
if you think he is today. We spoke before about how your father in many ways struggled to get support from white pastors and members of the clergy. Can you just share more about that experience too?
Yeah, so from 1955, when it all started going forward, he called the white moderate Christians, had a standoff position in terms of the movement, and they refused to lend their voices, they refused to lend their influence to the issues that were taking place during that time. And so when he was arrested in 1963, demonstrating in Birmingham, Alabama, to highlight the segregated conditions in public accommodations, they wrote him a letter criticizing his actions on a number of fronts, saying that they were untimely. They cast him as an outside agitator. They, counseled him that he should be more patient, with the process, and these things over time would change. And so my father eloquently wrote this letter from a Birmingham jail where he was confined solitarily and had no references with him, and other than the newspaper that they brought in that morning where this letter was located that he read. And so he started responding on the new edges of the newspapers. And when that ran out, he ended up using toilet paper. And that response basically, outlined, look, I'm here because injustice is here. And if you live anywhere within the boundaries, he said the United States of America, you can't be an outsider, the earth is the Lord's, the fullness thereof. And so injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That's where one of the phrases came about. And then he talked about, the fierce urgency of now, because African Americans have been waiting, for over 300 years for their freedom. And it's always, coming, it's always getting there. And justice too long delayed is justice denied, as he mentioned. And so you can't be patient when you see all these conditions that you're living with, the lynchings, and when you have to explain to your children about why they can't go, my sister in this instance, to Funtown, which is like a Six Flags of sorts, where they have roller coasters, etc. Then you understand why we find it difficult to wait. He went on to outline the process of how they got to Birmingham, that he didn't just come in on Birmingham's turf. He was in relationship with an allied organization of SCLC, which was the organization my father co-founded, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And then the Alabama Christian Movement was an organization that was headquartered there, and they invited Daddy in. And so he outlined these steps that they had already followed that now are part of our training and teaching nonviolence that we call Nonviolence 365, those 6 steps of nonviolence. And then he got to this section in there that really dived in to basically say how disappointed he was in the white church. That for him, the stagnation and the problems that are taking place in the South, are not because of the Ku Klux Klan and all of those obvious people who are segregationists, but it's really those who are on the sideline, those who should be a part of this movement and speaking out against these injustices, are white Christians who are hiding behind these stained glass windows. And he felt that, without their participation, it's a hypocrisy that they didn't truly represent the revolutionary gospel of Jesus Christ because they called his actions extreme. And he said, wasn't Jesus an extremist for love? So he was in good company, as far as he was concerned. And he felt that the church was not supposed to be aligned with the status quo, but it was supposed to be kind of standing on the outside and being kind of like a thermometer, not registering the temperature, but actually shifting the temperature of a society and a community. And so when we fast forward to today, there have been so many white churches that have been passive, have been silent, has separated, what's happening in society from the expression of religion in the church. That, our religion really has nothing to do with these social, quote unquote, justice issues. And yet everything that Jesus Christ stood for was about that. I mean, he was coming against systems and structures and practices in society. Jews and Samaritans should have no dealings. And yet he was constantly in the marketplace violating that and crossing lines and proving that, no, this is my brother, this is my sister. And regardless of what the rules are, I'm going to stand with them and stand by them and connect with them. The Sabbath day, you weren't supposed to heal on the Sabbath day. That was a violation. And we know the story of where, he did that. It goes on and on. And so I don't know how anyone who is a faith leader can sit idly by when the people who are part of their congregation, and even if they're not directly a part of their congregation, they're part of their fellowship of faith, is suffering at the hands of a society and structures and systems, and their loyalty and alliance is more political than it is Christed. That is the problem, and where Daddy was challenging them. He was really challenging the church to be more Christed, not necessarily political, but Christed. That be Christ in culture.
Wow. I mean, there's just so much there, so much richness that you shared. I think there was a bit of an awakening, it seems, after George Floyd's murder. It feels like so many white Christians and churches have started to actually vocalize about injustice. But it strikes me that, this isn't new. Brutality against Black people has been filmed for years, not even with Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice and all of these. It's not even with them. We go back to the civil rights movement and the brutality that was captured on film. I would love for you to just weigh in on what do you think is different about this time as opposed to times past?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic because the first reaction when you see brutality displayed, because that's what happened in 63 with the young people who had water hoses and dogs and billy clubs that were placed on them. That's what happened in 1965 with Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, when John Lewis and Hosea Williams and others were trying to cross that Edmund Pettus Bridge. It was the horrors of the pictures of human suffering that people witnessed that brought them into this place of consciousness and realization that we've got to stop it. And that's the same thing kind of that's happening now. The brutality is right before us. I'm cautiously optimistic because, as my father noted, that when it comes to acts like that, we can count usually on members of other communities to rally around. But when we move and start talking about how do we deal with issues of inequity and greater injustices that require some major shifts and changes in the way something looks, your staff, your boardrooms, your C-suites, etc. And people get uncomfortable and the support dissipates. And so I'm concerned that that support doesn't dissipate, that it goes beyond the monetary, which I think is one piece of it. We cannot exclude that piece. But the other piece is, what is it that I need to do inwardly in my institutions to change, to reflect an equitable environment? We can't even talk about equality because in so many ways, those of us in the Black community are far behind because of all of the disparities that have been created because of, white dominant structural systems. And you can, any white person can Google in any arena of American life, we have twice the bad and half the good. And so that suggests something. It's not because we're inferior. It's because there have always been those barriers. There's always been those attempts to marginalize us, to disenfranchise us, to devalue us, to leave us out, to redirect us, all of that. And so there has to be fundamental changes and sacrifices to bring about a more just and humane and peaceful world. And the thing, talking about my father, he would say, look, the stage of the movement that they made great strides in terms of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, that didn't cost America anything, zero. But the next stage is going to cost. I mean, there's a debt to pay when generations of people of descendants of from slavery through now descendants of slaves have been exploited, have been oppressed, have been marginalized and taken advantage of, and helped to build the economy of this country.
We have, I think, an audience of people watching this who are well aware and familiar with your father's work, but I want to switch gears for a minute and talk about your mother, because I think a lot of people don't realize that the legacy, Dr. King's legacy, and what we know it as today is really because of her work. Can you just share about her? I call her Dr. Coretta Scott King. I just call her Dr. Coretta Scott King, but can you please just share about her work and her activism in her own right?
Wow. Yeah. My mom, before she even met my father, was an activist at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. She was a part of the NAACP. And I can't remember the name of the political organization that she had joined. It was a progressive political organization at the time. She was an early joiner of the peace movement. So she had been traveling around the nation and world on issues of nuclear disarmament and things of that nature. And when she met my father, she was already very heavily into all of these causes. And so there was an alignment of mission and purpose when they met. And she was a concert singer when they met at New England Conservatory, not a concert, well, she was a concert singer, but she was studying to be a concert singer until she met my father. And I think she changed her concentration to music education. So that once they married, she could still use, still work somewhere. But she gave that gift up, supposedly, but ended up using it in the movement, doing freedom concerts, telling the story of the movement through narration and through song. So she did that many times when the SCLC was low on funds. So she was one of their major fundraisers, I would say. She was a strategist many times when they had the meetings that they had. She was one of the main voices and forces when my father spoke out against the Vietnam War. She constantly told him, look, we need your voice, your moral voice in the peace movement. And so in 1967, he finally spoke out against that. And so what I say to people is when my father was assassinated, she was not Coretta Scott King, the widow. She was Coretta Scott King in her own right, an activist who was now in an extraordinary position of continuing what they were doing together. And so the next phase of it for her was about how do I enshrine and institute the work of that we did in the movement that help us to bring about social change in society, that help us to literally change the landscape legally of the South, so that future generations would have it available to them in their freedom struggles. And so she created the Martin Luther King Memorial Center initially. Then it got changed to Martin Luther King Center for Social Change. Then finally got changed to the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. So she was on that track, building the institution so people would understand the nonviolent training that went behind those marches and demonstrations. They didn't just show up in marches and demonstrations. That's what it appears like today, and has become the more popular thing, the direct action. But there were 4 steps prior to direct action: information gathering, education, personal commitment, negotiation, even before you get to the streets. You've already been trying to negotiate certain demands and asks. And the direct action is what brought a creative tension to get people to either, if they didn't come to the table, or if they were at the table, to get them back at a table, so that you can move toward reconciliation, which was the final step after direct action. So she created the institution with that in mind, and to perpetuate my father's works and words. So we have an archive, for instance, at the King Center. And all along building that institution, once she set it in motion and it began to be built and opened, she then focused her energy on the holiday. 15 years from his death to the time that it passed, there were efforts over and over again. So what she did while she was building the center, she was very shrewd. She went around the world with her book initially, My Life of Martin Luther King Jr., spreading the message, the work that they had done in the South, the teachings of Dr. King all around the world, so that people would be aware of him and what his work was about. Then she started campaigns by writing letters to ask mayors and ask governors to support a holiday in their city or their state. And some of them began to do that. And she asked them to send their resolutions to the center. So we have a lot of those. And so it's building up this groundswell of support for a holiday at a federal level. And when she finally put her energy into it is when things started to change and shift. And eventually it was signed into the law. So there were 2 efforts for her to institutionalize him via a federal holiday, so that every year at the beginning of the year, we have to face this legacy and what it represents, because his birthday is in January. And this institution that continues to perpetuate the teachings and the education and the concept of how do we develop and build a beloved community. And so my conclusion is, I define her as the architect of this iconic person that we now recognize all around the world. He's one of the most influential leaders, even to this day, in death in the world. Because when he was assassinated, he was one of the most hated men in America, but he's in that position today because Coretta Scott King was very determined to make sure that people understood his work and its relevance for current day society. And even 50, how many years have he's been gone for 52 years. And people are still referring to him, talking about his teachings and being inspired by it. Wow. What does that say about, your servant leadership? It says volumes. That's how you leave a legacy.
Well, and that's why I wanted to bring her up, because I know there are a lot of people watching this. You're reading all of these books about all anti-racism, and that's important. Color of compromise, that's important. That's very important. But I think we also need to understand the role that Mrs. Coretta Scott King played. And to your point, I think institutionalizing the work that they did together. And I think that's an important strategy for justice. And you mentioned a phrase about this beloved community. I would love if you could share what your father's vision was for the beloved community and why that's crucial to justice.
Well, first of all, he believed it was realistic and achievable. It's not a utopia because there's conflict in a beloved community, but you agree on the means to resolve it in a peaceful way. It doesn't mean you don't have disagreements. It doesn't mean that you don't speak truth to power, but at your foundation, you are guided by love. The love means that you value the personhood of an individual. You treat them with dignity. You treat them with respect. And you're always striving to ensure that there's equity in a beloved community, and that there is a sharing attitude, that we want to make sure that all people have what they need in a beloved community, and that those things that threaten it, we all fight against. So the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism, issues of discrimination, things that flow out of poverty, those are the things that we do not tolerate in a beloved community. And that means you have to work toward eliminating them so that people can live out their best and true self without those threats. So that's the work that we're involved in. And it translates. It can translate into a corporation. It can translate. The church should be the first example of the beloved community, to be honest with you, because everything that Christ taught us is what my father just was able to, quote unquote, secularize and make it malleable for a society. It's not always malleable out of our different faith expressions for everybody to embrace, but really it's the Christ spirit that's infused all throughout my father's teachings and all throughout the beloved community. He did nothing that was not biblically based.
I am so grateful for your voice and the work that you're doing at the King Center to really make all of these principles of nonviolent social change actionable. For my last question, I think it would be wonderful if you could just share with people what's happening at the King Center and how can they lock arms with you and support the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, we're actually pulling some very exciting things together. I can't talk about every aspect of it, but what I will say is that we are digging in deep to help bring about major transformation in corporate settings, in institutional settings, so that they can reflect that beloved community, so that there is equity, so that there is some catching up. That's the phrase I like to use now. All of us kind of have to catch up. And what I mean by that is, in the white community, our white brothers and sisters have to catch up on how we got here. That means really becoming a student, a learner, a listener, and believe us when we say certain things, because that's very hard. When you've lived in a world of a dominant culture that favors you, that advantages you, that benefits you, that you have privilege in, you have to be willing to what Christ did. Christ, he emptied himself and he became, equal kind of, he came down to the space of where we were. He came down exactly to our space and began to understand our human struggle and suffering and experience. And that's what white culture has to do, because we have lived in the dominant culture. We understand it. We get it. I mean, our world has just been, white. The white culture has not understood and the whole experience of being Black in America. And they will never know it experientially, but they can know it by immersing themselves in readings and documentaries, going inside of the Black culture and a Black experience, going into communities and going to places that are, the Black arts, so to speak. Going to some restaurants and patronizing them. And it's a whole lot. So that's the catch up on that side. The catch up on the Black community side is, look, this is an uncomfortable conversation for a lot of people, but there's a debt owed. As Daddy said, this next phase, there's a cost that is associated with, because there's a debt. You look at a balance sheet, you got assets, you got, liabilities, you have income, you got debt. And the debt is the fact that we all would not be here today but for the exploitation. And people were exploited, taken advantage of through slavery, not paid for their wages. And then they were, killed, in very inhumane ways. And then fast forward, they were let free. Nothing was returned, given to them. Then they were exploited in terms of low wages. I mean, we could go on. And then what they finally built up was destroyed in the Black Wall Street in Tulsa. There are other places, the same story that occurred over and over again as we tried to, take our strides forward to freedom. There was always something in the way to destroy it, to tear it down. I think about my grandfather. My grandfather, my mother's father, started a lumber mill in Alabama, the first Black in Montgomery. In Marion, Alabama, and within 2 weeks, it had been destroyed. Now, it was hard at that time to investigate and figure, but it was racial. They didn't want him to have anything. So those stories over and over again. So there's a debt now that has to be paid. So what is reparations? That's what I'm getting into. What does that look like in America? It's not just giving a check to all of the descendants of slavery. That may be one facet of it, but it's multifaceted. And so when people now are reaching in their pockets and they're, investing in funds so that Black businesses can have the capital that they need to start businesses, because we still have discriminatory practices in banks where Blacks can't get loans. Then you have this that's kind of like paying that debt so that we can now build the wealth that we should already have in the Black community. And so it's that catch up that has to happen. So part of the work that we will be doing is helping with the catch up on the education and the learning, and also helping these companies to catch up to ensure that there's equity from the boardroom through the supply of diversity, through even investing in African-American financial institutions in communities where they exist, and those communities where those corporations do business. That is necessary. So this is some of the work as we also do the training in nonviolence as a part of that catch-up. We call it Nonviolence 365. So that's some of the work that we're doing. And I'm really excited about seeing more and more corporations and institutions reflecting the beloved community.
Well, listen, I'm so grateful for your work. I'm grateful for your passion, your energy. I know this is a very taxing time for you. So I'm grateful that you made the time to speak to this group of people who, they want to know better so they can do better. And I think this is the conversation we need to have. Dr. King, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
For our final conversation, I am honored to invite a group of young people who are organizing their generation to lead change. They are not the next generation. They are the now generation. Let us all lean in to listen and learn from them. I am so excited about this conversation. I believe that throughout the arc of this week, we have been so blessed to hear from people who have led the civil rights movement, people who have dedicated their lives, decades, to the study of theology and scholarship. And we're ending our exploration this week with a conversation with people I consider not to be generation next, but generation now. Zoe Upkins and Skyy Clark live in Nashville, Tennessee, and they have been galvanizing young people in their community to speak out against racial injustice. And I'm just so grateful to have you guys with me. I want to start here because racial injustice isn't new. It's well documented, but it seems like on May 25th, when the world watched George Floyd be murdered, it feels like it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And so I want to first ask, where were you and what were you doing when you learned of his murder? Let's start with Zoe.
I don't remember exactly where I was, but I remember I saw people have the video and everyone was watching it. And at first, because I knew what the video was about, I didn't really want to watch it because I was like, I feel like that's just going to really make me angry. And it took me a few days, I'm not going to lie, to actually watch the video. And when I watched it, I was just devastated. And I think that is, like you said, that was like the last straw. That was the last straw. And that's why everyone was just like so furious and so angry. But yeah, I don't think I remember exactly where I was, but it took me a while to actually watch the video.
What about you, Skyy?
Yeah, that was definitely the last straw. I think that was the moment where like everyone said, listen, we've had enough and we've been had enough, but we're about to show you that we've had enough. And so, they're just saying, look, we want justice, we want change, we want equality. And then, I was actually getting ready to shower. And then my dad sent me the video, and then I watched it, and it was heartbreaking to see. So
we find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic, and I think some people have been asking the question, what's been different? Because these issues are not new. One of the things that I think has happened is I think because of the pandemic, we, in many ways, who have been quarantined, have been forced to kind of sit in and marinate in what has happened. Whereas before, we're able to distract ourselves with the busyness of life. You all have become active in organizing during this pandemic. I'm just curious why. People would probably say, stay home, play it safe. Why did you find it was necessary to become active during this time? And Skyy, I'd love to start with you.
Unfortunately, we have to deal with COVID in a time like this where we really need to get outside and make a change. But there's also a bigger pandemic going on, and that's racism. And that's a problem that's been going on for way too long now, and I think it needs to stop.
Thank you for that. Zoe, tell me what you think.
I think, honestly, when everything started happening, I'm not going to lie, the coronavirus was kind of like the last concern on my mind. But I think this is definitely a time where especially our generation needs to get out because I feel like we're the generation that's just like 100% not used to this at all. Our parents are kind of different a little bit depending on how old they are, but they've probably seen more than we have. Not saying that we haven't seen like prejudice and like racism, but it's definitely not as bad as it used to be. So I feel like the fact that it's still going on in 2020 is the reason why we are just like, we need to get out, we need to make change. I need to know that this is not going to happen in our generation.
You make a really interesting point. I was thinking about this earlier this week. I'm 37 years old. I am the first generation in my family that was actually born with the full rights of being a citizen of this country, even though my family has been in this country for generations. I would love to know, how has racism touched your lives, and what has your experience been? Because you would think that we live in a society now where everyone is, so well educated, and of course racism doesn't exist. But how has it touched your life? And we can start with you, Zoe.
Mine is a little different, I feel like. But I go to basically an all-white school. So I've been since 5th grade. So I've been going there since 5th grade, and I'm about to be a senior. So that's a lot of years. And I feel like I've been called the N-word before at the beach. I've been called the N-word places before. But I feel like my racism that I've experienced throughout my life is just people not knowing, people living in a bubble, and they just don't know anything outside of their bubble. So if it doesn't affect them, then they don't know, they're not going to know anything about it. So I feel like just comments that people make, or because I have a Black friend, I'm not racist, stuff like that. It's just, I feel like that's what I was around when I was younger. But yeah, that's definitely how racism ties into where I am with my life.
How has racism touched your life, Skyy?
Well, when I was younger, we lived in Atlanta. We lived 20 minutes away from a KKK headquarters. So there's a lot of times where a lot of things happen. One time, someone set a snapping turtle on our front porch, just out of the blue. And then I have a white mom and a Black dad. And then if we're in the store with my mom, people would just look at my mom and give her a weird look or something. But mainly what Zoe said, it's people that have their own little bubble, and they just don't know any better. They just need to be educated.
Yeah, no, I hear you. It's funny, Zoe, something you said earlier is, you said, obviously I'd been called the N-word at the beach, and what's so unfortunate is it shouldn't be obvious, it shouldn't be expected. It should be shocking. It should be something that isn't part of our daily existence. I'm curious, as you all have been organizing your peers, and we'll talk a little bit more about the mechanics of that in a minute, but how have your parents responded to your activism? And again, I want to put this in the context of COVID-19, because I'm thinking about my own children, and I basically have them locked in the house 24 hours a day. How have your parents responded to your activism? I'll start with Skyy.
They're super proud the way I've been handling stuff and the way I've been using my platform, and they're just doing anything they can to help me create change. They're not really worried about the coronavirus pandemic, but they think this is the bigger picture. So this is what we need to focus on.
What about you, Zoe?
Mine weren't really the same way at first. I had to convince my dad to let me go to the protest. It's not that he doesn't want me there. It's just he was thinking well, what if the protests get out of hand? What if they start shooting rubber bullets at you? I don't want you to get shot, all this stuff. But then we were going back and forth on text message, and I even had to get my brother involved, who's older than me. He's 21. But I had to get him involved because I was this is so important. I'm I'm not going to stay at home while everyone else is protesting for my life. I had so many white friends that were going to the protest. I was if they're going to go to the protest, I definitely should be going to the protest. So my parents, they were kind of iffy at first, but I think that was just because they were concerned about my safety.
Yeah. And that's natural as a parent. I want to talk a little bit about just the work that you all have done. If you could share more about how this youth movement kind of has come to be in your local community, because it takes leadership, it takes energy, and to your point, Zoe, it really takes sacrifice. So I'd love to just start with you, if you can share more about what what's been happening there in Nashville and how you've been a part of what's been building there.
Well, I take no credit for what's been happening here. I give that all to Skyy because he was the one that organized everything that basically has been going on recently. But I've just been along on the ride. But he'll text me and be like, he said something. The first thing he did was he organized this thing downtown and like scraping down like all the graffiti and stuff, and got a bunch of people to help with that. And then the second thing that he did that was really huge was this thing in Brentwood, and it was basically a night of prayer and worship, and it was just amazing. And I sang at it, which is how I was involved in it. But the whole idea and stuff came from Skyy. So
I love it. That's why I wanted him to go second, because I want him to get all the shine here. So Skyy, let's talk about just what you've been up to and how you've been able to galvanize your peers. What has that looked like, and what has it required?
Definitely required a lot of prayer, because it wasn't easy. But I have a huge following on Instagram, so I feel like God gave me that to use it for good and to do things like that. So my mom's actually the one that came up with the idea for the prayer night. So I give all the credit. That's her. But it was a really fun night. Zoe blew the crowd away. We had a lot of great speakers, and the whole night it was a huge turnout. I was expecting like 20, 40 people to come, but I think they said there was like close to 700 people.
Wow. And so what do you want to continue to build from that? You know, when you create that platform for people to come together, it feels like, all right, what's next? So what's on your mind and what's in your heart?
Right now, I'm trying to think of a way to get a huge like Black excellence mural somewhere downtown in Nashville. I think that's my next thing, but yeah, I'm still praying about it and still thinking of options, and so yeah.
No, that's good. I want to ask a question because I think part of the state of our country really, in my opinion, has to do with the fact that history, the true, authentic history of this nation, is not taught in our schools. I would love to learn more about, you're in school now. What have you learned about the history of this nation in school, as opposed to the true history that we're all kind of learning now, and how you've had to educate yourself? Zoe, I'd love to start with you just in terms of, how has what you've learned in school either supported your identity as a young Black woman, or has it raised more questions that you've had to research on your own?
Honestly, I feel like I've kind of learned the same thing throughout all of my years in school about our history. And sometimes whenever we start talking about it, we veer away from the conversation, I guess, because no one really likes to talk about how we were enslaved for so many years, But I feel like there wasn't really anything new that I learned in school about like our topic, especially like I don't know. I feel like we always learned just that we were slaves, and we just learned about slavery. But past that, we didn't really learn much. And I feel like because we learned about slavery in school, and because of the school I go to, all white school, I feel like that's why people think that things like that, obviously it's not slavery, but things like that are happening today. And I think that's why people don't really know, because we're not learning about anything current that's happening. We're just learning about slavery. And obviously slavery isn't a thing anymore, but things that are like slavery are happening still today.
That's an interesting point that I hadn't considered. I think you're right, where when the essentially totality of the Black experience is taught really through the lens of slavery, and it basically ends at emancipation, but it doesn't also teach about the systems that have been built in order to perpetuate slavery, as you mentioned. I think you're right. We missed something. Skyy, what's your thought on that, and the role that teaching this history and this reality plays in shaping your generation's understanding of injustice?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of things that you don't learn in school. Like, I knew nothing about Juneteenth. The Tulsa Massacre, I didn't know about that. And there's a whole bunch of events that I've been learning about through this time and through research. And like, Beethoven was Black. Like, nobody knew about that, and that was a huge shock. So yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of Black history that's been missing in school books, and I think that they should definitely start teaching that, because it's really important history.
Yeah, it feels like we lose so much when we don't understand. I mean, because that's who we are. You can't separate. It's funny, we have, Black history education, but you really cannot separate Black history from American history because they are integrated. They're the same thing.
Exactly.
I would love it if you could speak to, there's a lot of parents watching this. There are a lot of young people watching this. How can youth use their voice and their energy to make a difference? What would you say to them? Let's start with you, Skyy.
Well, if anybody is telling you that your voice doesn't matter, it does. Don't let anybody else tell you otherwise. This battle between evil and good is something that can't be won without you. And it's going to take you, it's going to take me, it's going to take your next door neighbor. And not a lot of people can do great things, but everybody can do small things out of great love. And so if you add all those little things together, it creates a bigger picture, and it creates the change that we want to see. And it all starts with you, the person in the mirror.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's awesome. Zoe, what would you like to say to youth and how they can use their voice to help affect change?
I would say that it's not a battle between Black and white. Like Skyy said, it's good and evil. It's just like good decency. Like, you should know good and bad. Like, everyone should be equal. Like, everyone in their mind, I feel like, should just think that the fact that this is even a thing is just insane. But like Skyy said, like, your voice matters. And if you think it doesn't, it matters. It doesn't matter how big of a platform you have, like, speak out about it, because silence isn't okay. Like, you should speak about it. And yeah, I feel like everyone should use their voice, whether their platform is small or big, and just speak your mind.
I think for my final question, I want to give you all an opportunity to issue a charge and a challenge to everyone who's watching. For those people who have been, with us all week and they've watched every segment and they're just really on fire now to make a difference, as well as for those people who may have just tuned in and you're the first voices that they've heard. What would you like to say to them, just to encourage them to lean in? And we'll start with Zoe.
I would say, I don't know how everyone would appreciate this, but I like the fact that even if I would say post about it, all that and stuff, but if you have someone that's really dear to you and they are Black, they're African American, I would say something to them. Just say something. Like, it could come off offensive, like, why are you texting me? But I really appreciate, I have had a lot of friends that just, like, have been checking in on me, just making sure, like, I'm okay, like, anything they can do. And that, like, it really is dear to me because it shows me that they actually care and they actually understand what's going on, because silence it really shows a lot about who you are. And it really does hurt whenever you have, like, some of your closest friends, like, haven't addressed the situation at all, So I just would say, reach out to people, make sure they're doing okay, and just continue to use your voice to raise awareness, because change needs to come.
So good. So good. Skyy, I'm going to give you the last word. What charge would you like to issue to the people who are watching right now?
It's definitely it doesn't cost a thing to make a change. It doesn't cost a thing to just reach, like Zoe said, reach out to someone who you think is dear to you, and it's only going to help create change that we want to see. We should all just come together as a country come together as a world and create nations across the world that'll make this world thrive.
Wow. Skyy, Zoe, I am so grateful for both of you. You truly are Joshuas for this generation. I just pray that God will continue to use you. I just pray that your voice will continue to be lifted up, because you truly are examples of what can happen when we have conviction to mobilize. So thank you all for watching, whether you just tuned in for this segment or you've been watching us all week long. I'm so grateful that you spent this time with us. I hope that you have taken what you need from this in order to begin to mobilize toward change. What I believe in my heart is that these young people, they are the true reflection of what can happen when we decide to confront and dismantle racism in America once and for all. Thank you for watching.
How you doing? I'm Miles McPherson, pastor of the Rock Church in San Diego and author of The Third Option, Hope for a Racially Divided Nation. And hope is exactly what we need, but what is it? Hope is an expectation of something good and is often inspired by a dream for a better tomorrow. I would propose that there's no better dreamer for a united country than Martin Luther King. Dr. King had a dream that we can all resonate with. It's a dream that originates from the heart of God. It was a dream anchored in a commitment to the fulfillment of God's dream in every person. It was a dream of peace, not only in the sense of absence of violence, but defined by the fulfillment of God's desire for all people. It was a dream to see God's image expressed to its fullest throughout the earth as he intended. When God's dream for some people are being undermined and hindered, we need to strive for freedom and equality. That is what Dr. King gave his life for. Dr. King also believed that racism is a spiritual issue because it sees God's image in yourself as more valuable than in others. Dr. King was confronted by a governmental system that consistently and systematically undermined not only its own promises, but the kingdom of God values. It violated its promise to protect the unalienable nature of the image of God in all people. He, however, saw past that to a day when it would be different. The Bible says in Mark chapter 1, verse 6-8, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. As John the Baptist was sent to prepare the world for Jesus, Dr. King was sent as a forerunner to proclaim the dream that God had for America, a dream that acknowledges that every person is made in the image of God. He had a dream of what it looked like when the violations of our God-given unalienable rights were restored. He was a true forerunner of not only the dream, but what the future dreamers would look like, black and white, arm in arm, fighting for the dignity of each other, equal rights for all people, for God's best to flourish in each person, no matter the color of their skin. As we prepare for the National Weekend of Action starting tomorrow, we must remember that racism is seen less in another because of the color of their skin and is expressed by injustices in any area of life, as well as any inequities perpetrated systematically on our neighbor by culture. Again, as always, you have a choice to make. Contribute to a culture of racism by denying and turning a blind eye to the ugly disparities based on skin color, or committing to being an ambassador for unity and love by repenting and confessing those perspectives. As we transition into a time of prayer, spend a few minutes praying in these three areas. Ask God to forgive you of any sense of pride over anyone who is different than you. Ask God to help you see the image of God in every person. And ask God to lead you to heal any breach between your heart and the hearts of your African-American brothers and sisters. God bless you.
Hey, I'm Reggie Joyner, CEO of Orange, and our organization exists to influence those who influence the faith of the next generation. And we believe we are living in a defining moment in our history because of the conversations that are happening right now around race. As a white leader and pastor, I'm convinced that the way we respond to this issue is important for a lot of reasons. But here's one reason I want you to consider. There's a generation of kids and teenagers who will decide what they believe about God and the church based on how we respond to this issue of race. And that's why I'm so excited about so many of the conversations that are happening right now. And that's why I want to invite you to join Orange as we participate with key leaders around our country for a Faith and Prejudice masterclass. It will be a 4-week experience where you can learn from experts in the space of racial justice and reconciliation through weekly videos. You'll also be able to take part in constructive weekly conversations via Zoom with Nona Jones and other seasoned leaders. It's called Faith and Prejudice because our faith should affect our prejudice. Our faith should compel us to confront the racism that exists in this generation. Here's why. Because if we don't, then our prejudice will continue to negatively affect the faith of a generation who's watching us. I really hope you'll join a host of churches and families to do what I'm going to do, to listen, to learn. Because until we understand the whys that exist behind some of the prejudice in our country, we can't really be a part of the solution. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, during the beginning of the civil rights movement. During those decades, too many of us didn't show up for this conversation. That's why the Faith and Prejudice Initiative is so important now. That's why I'm so hopeful in this decade we have a chance to do something we didn't 50 years ago. Let's get it right this time. To register, please go to thinkorange.com/faith and prejudice.
We have been challenged, but more than challenged, we have been called. You are not watching this by accident. You are watching this because you have been called to be the change we so desperately need in this country. James chapter 2, verse 17 compels us as Christians to allow the works of our faith to demonstrate what we believe. So now, visit faithandprejudice.com for resources to put your faith to work. Thank you for watching.